Okay, so um, I'm Yoel Toms, and I'm part-time studio lecturer on the MA Art and Ecology, standing in for Sue Hale this term to host the Art PG Talks. Since the COVID-19 pandemic, the global society has experienced an unprecedented form of atomization with the weaponization of COVID-19. Power is increasingly shifting towards the aesthetic realm as technological sensory assemblages are becoming the means for governing people. Social life becomes a direct input to capitalist production. The reach of states and corporations into our lives via cards and apps has never been greater. It's been proclaimed that the great battle of our time is the battle for ownership of the digital footprints that make up our lives. The series Augmentation is looking at how digital augmentation is changing every aspect of life on Earth. Computation and data are increasingly and pervasively environmentalized, intimate, and new forms of governmentality and power emerge through the cyberneticization of our societies. Capturing and processing social data is today handled by an emerging social quantification sector, such as Equifax, Meta, or Alphabet. And the result is a new social order based on continuous tracking and offering unprecedented new opportunities for social discrimination and behavioral influence. This order has disturbing consequences for freedom, justice, and power, as the book The Costs of Connection illustrates. Data colonialism justifies what it does as an advance in scientific knowledge, personalized marketing, or rational management, just as historic colonialism claimed a civilizing mission. And increasingly, artists and cultural institutions are intervening in developing new tactic skills and complex transdisciplinary counter-assemblages to engage the augmenting strata of this techno-ecological condition. So the augmentation theme is a way to address some of the long-term consequences of the move to the online art model accelerated by lockdown, and questions how to develop this more systemically and consequentially rather than just business as usual. So far, we've heard from Eva Yager and Victoria Ivanova and also Wasim Al-Sindi. And today, we're very lucky to hear from Anna Engelhardt, a key thinker, activist, and artist in the domain of digital militarism, cyber conflicts, and Russian colonial invasion. The usual format is for the speaker to present a fairly conversational talk for 30 to 40 minutes, and then we have about 20 to 30 minutes for discussion afterwards, where Maria and I will help field your questions for Anna. Next week, we're going to hear from Wasim Al-Sindi again with Yaya Clara Becker, and that will offer some opportunities for you to respond to his discussion last week as well. And on the 6th of June, the US-based Xiaowei Wang, Accounting for Accountability in Rural China. So this is a reminder for any of you who haven't done it already to put your name and your course, etc., in the chat. And if you have any questions as they arise, please also put them in the chat. Anna Engelhardt is someone that you want to have with you in the sprawl. She's a Russian research-based media artist and writer. Their investigations take on multiple forms of media as they develop into infrastructures, including publications, videos, websites, and physical objects. Their primary interest lies in decolonial approaches to cyberspace, which they advance in their PhD on Russian cyber warfare as colonial enterprise. Engelhardt has shown their works at Transmediale 2022, Venice Biennale, Architectura 2021, Ars Electronica 2020, Strelka Magazine, and I mean, she's very busy. She's all over the place at the moment. So in her talk, Engelhardt will elaborate on her practice that engages weaponized technical infrastructures that cast information in projectiles. Weaving together her work on cyber warfare, propaganda backends, and smart weapons, she will lay out the logistics of perception that supplies Russian colonial wars. If there is a relationship between production and destruction, as Harun Farocki suggested, how do production and destruction relate in information structures, asks Anna. So to explore this connection further, they will examine web-based methods that make their infrastructures coexist, clash, and infiltrate the networks under investigation. So without further ado, Anna Engelhardt.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay? Just a second to share the screen. Okay, I'm gonna start now. Hi everyone. Yeah, my name is Anna, as already introduced. I'm not gonna make a very intellectually heavy presentation, hopefully, but I wanted to introduce in general what aspect of my practice I'm gonna talk about. And today I wanted to address through three works that I'm gonna present is the fact that weapons are usually imagined as standalone objects of various kinds. Nevertheless, weapons are included in dense networks of relationships, even though these relationships are for extreme violence. Such relational networks that weapons create should be seen as infrastructures. Weapons, as I will show you, rely on and work as infrastructure. I wanted to start showing you the clip from my first work.
Ladies and gentlemen, we made a decision to continue military intervention that Russia started in 2014. This year, Russia occupied Crimean Peninsula with proxy soldiers. Now we feel the need to move military presence further. Today, I would love to show you the new project of Russian colonialism, the Crimean Bridge. It is the project of national importance that guarantees that Russia will follow the same military strategy against Ukraine. 2014 military intervention made it very clear. If you make an act of aggression, this aggression needs to be outsourced and made invisible. If you desire action, it should be covered by a smokescreen. If you create military infrastructure, it needs to be agreed. Such a bridge is the project we present today that will enable Russian government to freely establish control. The Crimean Bridge is Russian colonialism hidden in plain sight. Indeed, it would not be possible without Russian and Western colonial cooperation. You are invited to learn more about the project. Thank you for your attention.
Давай! Давай, держаться всем! Лево держаться! Бортов! 8:21! Вперед, машина 4 вперед!
What you saw in this clip is the deepfake I made. The deepfake essentially presents the project, an infrastructure that was created by Russia to cement its annexation of Crimea in 2014. Crimean Bridge was built with the multiplicity of agendas, of colonial agendas. And I think Crimean Bridge, in that sense, presents a very useful case to understand how Russian colonialism in Crimea functions and how essentially infrastructure of Crimean Bridge functions there as a hybrid, as a type of hybrid warfare. So Crimean Bridge fulfills essentially two functions. First, the most evident one is the act of easing the colonial control by allowing colonial troops and settler colonizers, Russians in that case, to access the peninsula freely. Since 2014, since the annexation, Crimean demographic has been actively affected by the Russian population. Russians have been actively displacing Ukrainians in the peninsula. The majority of Ukrainians who were obviously not supporting the Russian government had to leave Crimea after the annexation. Furthermore, Crimean Bridge not only allows this like physical connection, It also works as an invasive infrastructure in the terms of Anne Laura Stoller, a Canadian decolonial scholar. Stoller analyzes how invasive structures, or known also as critical infrastructures, displace and inflict violence on local population. And Crimean Bridge is a very evident example of such violence, because the networks of roads that were built to connect to the Crimean Bridge to bring it further into peninsula created displacement of many villages on its way. Apart from the fact that to build the bridge, there needed to be heavy mining of sand intensified in the peninsula to create the matter that would then constitute the bridge. But what is less rarely noted is the second function of the bridge, which is actually a new logistical border regime. Such border regime prevents, as you can see on the map, Crimean Bridge is built in between the Black Sea, which is the black space below, and the Azov Sea, which is the black space above. In Azov Sea, there are several strategic Ukrainian harbors, such as Mariupol and Odessa. The building of Crimean Bridge allowed Russia to create literally a border to control Ukrainian logistics, not only military logistics, like prohibiting Ukrainian military vessels from entering the sea, therefore allowing Russia an unprecedented advantage into the front of the east of Ukraine. I don't know if all of you know, but just to clarify that in 2014, Russia not only annexed Crimea, but also invaded the east of Ukraine. So the Crimean Bridge started functioning, essentially, was built to function as an infrastructure that would supply both fronts, front in the Crimea and front in the east of Ukraine. Therefore, Ukraine, the aim was to weaken the Ukrainian presence in the east, and Crimean Bridge has been used as a strategic weapon in the recent escalation of the invasion. Russia eventually banned all military logistics in the area under the premise of the security regime of the bridge for 1 year before and until the recent escalation in February. So you can see that infrastructure in that case functions as this multifaceted hybrid warfare, which I summarize with the next clip. But most importantly, the bridge as a project, and this is why I was using deepfake in the very beginning, and also why I was using for this project such a visual metaphors. The bridge itself exists not only as physical infrastructure, but also as an infrastructure in the cyberspace. The Crimean Bridge works as what Brian Larkin called poetic infrastructures. Those are infrastructures that essentially exist as propaganda projects. They're not less important or even more important as symbolic artifacts rather than infrastructures as the material objects themselves. We know a lot of cases when infrastructure was not finished or was not finished like it was planned initially, but the most important is that it can be used then for the political claims. Crimean Bridge is one of those poetic infrastructures. What you can see on this slide is a person in Moscow attending one of many exhibitions dedicated to Crimean Bridge and watching Crimean Bridge in the immersive VR experience. This was not the standalone instance of those VR experiences. There has been massive 360 panoramas and all sorts of other immersive experiences that were meant to create a digital version of the breach. So for me, approaching this project, it was important to create a digital doppelganger of the breach. It was important to address it not only as a multifaceted infrastructure in the physical space, but also as an infrastructure that spans and exists in the cyberspace. With that, I created also the photogrammetry that you saw on the previous clip. The photogrammetry was created from the videos of Russian propaganda. So I tried to reclaim the logistics of perception in that case. I tried to reclaim the visual narrative to amplify the uncanny, monstrous nature of the breach rather than the wide, sleek surface that is presented to us. So with that project, I got interested in how propaganda infrastructures can create harm and can be used as weapons to supply militaries both in cyberspace and in offline space. It was interesting for me to look further into that. With that, I developed into the new project, which was called Infrastructures with my collaborator, Sasha Shostakova. One of the main ideas behind the project is the very definition and the history of the term infrastructures. The term infrastructure was developed into the proper critical infrastructure studies that we know today by Susan Leigh Starr, 90s anthropologist. Even in those early writings on the infrastructure, that is one of the most important critical lenses in the media studies. Susan Leigh Starr was very critical of using infrastructure only as a physical domain. She famously claimed that infrastructure is not an object. Infrastructure is a set of relations. It might be an immaterial subject. It essentially constitutes the most important part of the infrastructure that's relational in nature, rather than the invisibility or physical materiality of it. So with that idea of infrastructure as a relation, it became clear that infrastructure, with the Latin prefix infra, can relate to the new term that we coined intrastructure. Intrastructure combines this relational nature of the infrastructure as developed by Starr with the Baradian approach to interaction. Interaction for Karen Barad, a new materialist who I am sure most of you know. Karen Barad coined the term interaction to question the term interaction. For her, interaction was not satisfactory because interaction implies the pre-existence of subjects that then gonna interact with each other. For Barad, there is no distant subjects or fully autonomous subjects. Because of her approach, she comes to a conclusion that any interaction is in fact interaction, because the subjects co-constitute each other in the process of making. And this interactive processes of constitution and the process-orientedness of this subject existence informed the idea, how can we approach infrastructure then? Thinking about it as this weird relational matter that doesn't have to exist materially. And in this project, we developed this notion of infrastructure. Infrastructure essentially was developed as a Telegram bot. We followed actually existing tradition of Russian workers to unite on Telegram channels. They work usually as a like professionally oriented like graphic designers would have a Telegram channel where they can exchange tips or ask for feedback or exchange funny stories or give feedback on their employers and stuff. So we thought we didn't know if those exist for propaganda workers. We know that those exist for journalists, for instance, but we thought, what if we make a Telegram chat that would enact a conversation that happens between propaganda workers. And those propaganda workers would not be limited to people who work in the newsfeed, but show propaganda as a spectrum of the violence from different that unites people with different backgrounds and people with different professional knowledge. With this project, it was important to highlight those material, experiential aspects that constitutes the propaganda infrastructures from the inside. A lot of things that you're going to see in the Telegram bot. The Telegram bot itself can be downloaded. I mean, you can search on Telegram infrastructures and you're going to see the bot. If you have a Telegram messenger, it's very easy to join the bot. And then for a week, it's going to recreate this imaginary chat that we co-authored. So in the Telegram bot, there are various workers that exchange their experience. They might be dissatisfied with their work or be proud or brag about how efficient what was their campaign or how inefficient or nonsensical their work is. One of the people that I want to showcase you who we fictioned in is a imaginary character based on several factual stories that we know. Those stories are of an actual fashion house in Moscow that was serving one of the biggest brands of Ministry of Defense. So we tried to imagine this Moscow graphic designer who is going to parties, but simultaneously tries to understand his relationship to the Russian army. And then he, during the story that he's saying that he met one of the people in the Ministry of Defense, and then the person in the Ministry of Defense exchange cards with each other. In Moscow at the time, there was a very nasty situation with the parties, which were swatted frequently. So he was very excited that he can have a important defense figure as his number to call in case if he gets in trouble because of drugs or anything. But he was wondering why would a defense person need a graphic designer as a friend. And eventually he found out, eventually he got a call from him asking if he knows someone who would be ready to do a hustle that he's not going into details about. He agreed himself, and upon arrival to the Ministry of Defense, he found out that essentially what they're asking him to do is to Photoshop several satellite images. As he found out later, we based this story on the actual Bellingcat. I don't know if you know that this is an investigatory agency that has been famous, has become famous for investigating Russian downing of MH17. Bellingcat did an actual forensic analysis of an actual photoshopped satellite images that were presented by the Ministry of Defense, claiming why they were not downing MH17. So this guy is laughing that he became famous somehow online because he photoshopped clouds on those images. Next person who is replying to him is a worker of a factory that produces inflatable weapons. Inflatable weapons are actually used military technology that creates fake weapons or fake military capacities where they don't exist. The character that we imagined here is a one critical of his work, not critical as in critical of Russian colonial heritage, but critical of how much sense do those fake weapons make in the actual battlefield. He loves telling different stories of how they try to sell and or upsell those fake weapons online and pretend that they actually seem legible in the military environment. So on the image on the right, you can see the 2D cardboard tank carried by the militaries from the work. And the last project I wanted to talk about today is one that is most related. Sorry, I wanted to briefly mention with the previous project that one of the ideas also of this spectrum of the infrastructure was that in colonialism, there's this idea, like there's constant desire of the empire to separate empire from the colony. The experience of metropole is usually portrayed as not connected to the one in the colony. And we all know those narratives of UK was separated from India by the ocean or like the sea, the water used as a separator. Those separators are not very objective or like very material. They are reflecting this desire to split the wealthy, peaceful life that happens in the metropole from the violence and atrocities that are constantly inflicted in the colonies. So with this project, we essentially wanted to bridge this gap, to show the spectrum of how those environments of culture or journalism or content production in general that are usually seen to be disconnected or don't associate themselves with the kinetic violence that happens, in that case, east of Ukraine, how they are actually connected very deeply with each other. So yeah, and the last project that I want to talk about today is one that deals with the logistic of perception very in detail. Logistics of perception is a term, or shall I say, an idea that was coined by Paul Virillia. He didn't elaborate on it as much, but for him, the idea was that perception itself is a material process, especially in the military conflict. So how this knowledge acquisition about the enemy and knowledge processing about the enemy can be thought of logistically. He doesn't go much into the material side of things, but this notion of logistics of perception was very interesting for me, so I decided to develop it further in my last project, Death Under Computation. Death Under Computation is still on view in the HMKV Media Art Museum in Dortmund, Germany. The project exists as simultaneously a website, which you can see online live, and an installation physically in space. I'm going to talk about relationship between those later, but first I wanted to concentrate on the idea that lays behind this investigation. An investigation deals with how contemporary Russian smart weapons are rooted in largely unknown Soviet military cybernetic experiments from the 1950s. For me, it was interesting that to see how also the history of Soviet cybernetic, a very known phenomenon in arts especially, totally emits the shadowy figure of its father, which is the military cybernetics. As many of you might know, Soviet cybernetics, which is civilian cybernetics, has been banned until the middle of 50s. But during the ban on the cybernetics was proliferating in the military domain. So this project looks into this era of cybernetics to see how the colonial Soviet mindset informed the Soviet cybernetics as a discipline, and how I was trying to find bottlenecks there, like the weak points that are getting inherited in future iterations of weapons, because as some of you might know, weapons are technological assemblages. If you think about your phone, they don't get redeveloped from scratch every time. They get updates, they get patches, they get all sorts of things that are built on the skeleton of the previous developments, which also implies that if there is a flaw in the logic or a miscalculation in the logic of the weapon, this miscalculation is going to be inherited again and again until it is actively improved or deemed obsolete. This project also, to develop these conceptions further, I developed a series of conversations which is still ongoing. The last one is going to take place in June about anti-colonial hacking. But the conversations take place on the Berlin-based platform Trust in collaboration with OXLN. I assume you know them because you have heard lectures from Vasim. And I invite their philosophers of cyber warfare to think with me on the questions that I highlighted. But coming back to the bolts and nuts of the project. So this is the, I want to read along a short bit from the text that is available on the website and then explain what you see on the screen. A hidden presence tracks American soldiers through the rainforest. The military team, rendered as colorful bodies through the infrared vision of the stalker, sense the threat. Spooked, they peer into the foliage, but cannot locate the creature who hunts them down one by one. It is camouflaged, translucent, almost impossible to target and destroy. Enraged and hopeless, the soldiers start shooting blindly into the trees. What drives the plot of the 1987 film Predator is the formula visibility equals death. This formula, coined by Bosquet in Antoine Bosquet in 2018, means that regardless of the lethality of a gun, one cannot aim at an enemy what one cannot see. Simultaneously, exposure to the enemy's gaze means exposure to their violence. The predator is akin to the guerrilla warrior or resistance fighter, less visible and better informed than their numerically superior enemies. Their advantage depends on knowledge of the terrain, its valleys, hills, foliage, and topography. In colonial wars, resistance fighters rely on this information asymmetry to succeed with their tactics and strategies: ambush, sabotage, and constant discrete movement of supplies and forces. So essentially, you can see what's happening on the screen, right, is a bit from the movie Predator. And I thought it is very productive to think along the lines of the narrative of this film, because it crystallizes the colonial paradigm that informs the idea that empire is always technologically superior, whereas non-white people or subjects to be colonized are always technologically inferior. Predator, in that sense, creates a very interesting ambivalence between those conceptions, because if some of you may be seen this film, it's quite known mass culture development. In the film, Predator is presented as this primitive alien, a racialized subject, but what is interesting is that Predator still has some sort of technological superiority. This technological superiority is racialized. It comes from its fanatic nature or those uncanny weapons. But still, Predator has an informational advantage over its enemy. So in the project, I was interested in the ideas of informational advantage and how military cybernetics was born to solve this informational disadvantage of the empire. I try and approach different states of the steps of the kill chain that was developed in the military cybernetic projects to see how the colonial thinking misinforms the Soviet engineers in their imaginaries of what would be an efficient weapon in the colonial war. I'm not going to go much into detail about what exactly those bottlenecks are. I invite you to visit the website if you want to learn more about those. I wanted to stop for a bit and to develop further the idea of like the connection between the website and the installation in space. For me, one of the main mediums of my work have always been websites. So coming back to the setting of the gallery, it was a very interesting idea to think along how to make a website in the gallery space as a knowledgeable, translation rather than dissatisfied, secondary subject. So with this project, I tried to simultaneously think of the website as a physical form. As soon as my visual essays usually work as scrolls, I was thinking about with a graphic designer, Anamika Singh. I was thinking along the ways to represent the textual scroll on the textile as a version of a website scroll. The interesting point for me came in thinking how can I bring digital objects, or how can I make digital objects in the gallery space correspond or be in dialogue with the digital project objects in the website itself. So I don't know if it works well. But those are the videos of the holograms that you could see as still images on the previous slides. So I try to think of those digital objects simultaneously existing both online and offline to tell the narrative that you can see represented both on the scroll and on the website. The objects themselves, the map you can see now as a still image on the left, is a part of my research in the archival research, and the map is an actual military map that was used by Russian soldiers in the first invasion of Chechnya in 1995. This is the map that aimed to portray the movement of the decolonial resistance fighters. I don't know if this is a well-known fact, but Russia invaded Chechnya in 1994, and this war was ultimately unsuccessful. Chechen resistance managed to defeat Russian invaders in 1996. The same fate awaited Soviet militaries in Afghanistan, where some of those cybernetic weapons were tested. So those unsuccessful military wars, unsuccessful from the perspective of the invader, became a major constellation point for me to think through the ways decolonial resistance can hack into those systems or can subvert those systems in their active resistance. Yeah, the first conversation I had in the series on trust was with the cyber war philosopher Svetlana Matvienko. With her, we discussed a broadcast of Russian shelling of Zaporizhia nuclear power station in the east of Ukraine. It was one of the most uncanny broadcasts. It was the most uncanny broadcast I have ever witnessed in my life. The broadcast essentially was portraying how Russian military was shelling the active nuclear power plant, the biggest nuclear power plant in Europe, and the fire that followed the shelling. So you could see Russian invasion and rebelling online in this kind of uncanny TV show manner that got amplified recently with the seizure of the Azovstal plant in Mariupol. So with Svetlana, we discussed the different convergence of the cyber and the nuclear. Second conversation was recently with Antoine Bosque, who I quoted earlier about the equation visibility equals death. Antoine is a science and technology studies thinker, but for him, the technologies are military technologies. He wrote 2 books on the scientific warfare. So he wrote extensively on various technologically augmented perceptors, but also on the cybernetic warfare that was used in US. So we had a dialogue with him comparing or informing each other on the cybernetic access of American and Soviet warfare. And the upcoming conversation, sorry, let me see the date. I think it's on the 10th of June. It's going to be with Sophie Tupin. Sophie wrote several publications and her whole PhD. One of those publications are on Influx on the anti-colonial hacking in the apartheid Africa. So we're going to have a conversation with her on different modes of cyber warfare and hacking as a means of decolonial resistance. Yeah, I think this is it for the prepared slides, but I would be more than happy to answer any questions in regards to those. Thank you.
Hi, Anna. Thank you so much for that discussion of some of your works. And yeah, I have some kind of questions lined up for you, but I want to also ask everyone involved to engage with you and pick your brain about countering kind of these colonial cyber logics that are kind of capturing and exploiting and invading not only state territories, but our own bodies and things like that. So I was I'm kind of aware of the trap of falling into the logic of something that you described, but I would like to kind of expand on this question of North and South that you spoke about in the futures of Russian decolonization. So you've written that the West's self-obsession with itself, or you describe how Western scholars either praise or criticize the idea of the West itself, and then it kind of gets stuck in this circle of unable to think outside of that geographic context. But then I think in that article, you kind of expand on that idea of that kind of trap, that loop in relation to post-Soviet space. And I wonder if you could kind of elaborate on that a bit.
Yeah, thank you very much for breaking the ice with the first question. And I think this is essentially why I find infrastructures so fascinating as a mode of study, because they allow to very materially break the binaries of the global North and the global South. Those binaries do exist, of course, but there is a space of the so-called second world, which is usually omitted in the post-colonial discussions. of the global north and the global south, and I'm not alone with that as a Russian. Chinese scholars who try to discuss, or Chinese artists who try to address the colonialism of China, I usually met with silence in the best case scenario. So for me, infrastructures allow, like I showed with the Crimean Bridge, to show the convergence of a multitude of colonialisms that are usually at play, because it's never like colonial violence is never singular, right? It's always a multifaceted monster of 5 different oppressions, in like multiplying each other or like battling for power. So in Crimean Bridge, for instance, Crimean Bridge was one of the major sponsors were coming from the global north. There were a lot of European sponsors on the list that did a very not advanced even hiding of the traces of their involvement. Obviously, Bridge was claimed to be sanctioned, but as we see today with the oil and gas situation, for every sanction, there is always a loophole. So those infrastructures allow me to show how different colonialisms, such as Western colonialism, Russian colonialism, and then different types of Western and Russian colonialisms inform each other in one or another project. The same situation happens actually with the Death Under Computation project. It was very interesting to talk with Antoine on the US military cybernetic, because what we found out during our conversation is a lot of US military thinkers were actually copying the work of Soviet military thinkers to then use in their own colonial wars. And then Soviet military thinkers were copying American military thinkers who were copying them. So there's always this really intense exchange happening between the empires, to the extent that I'm not going to recall who exactly stated, but someone coined the term imperial atmospheres or environments, because it's so hard to differentiate fully one type of colonialism, or like one colonialism like Russian colonialism from American colonialism, that it creates that sort of like environment of very similar tactics that collaborate with each other. And the last thing that I wanted to mention is in Russian invasion of Ukraine, Russia is using a lot of weapons, as in material weapons, not only ones that were actually supplied to Russia by the West, as became known as a part of the massive scandal that is still unfolding, but also weapons as a technologies that were used by the West in its previous colonial conflicts. There has been used like the indiscriminate weapons that were used by Britain in its colonial invasions, and US in its colonial invasions. And it's not a coincidence. It's a very, there was somewhere a research center in the middle of Russia that was studying what those other countries were doing, and trying to learn lessons from those that are called local wars. So yeah, a bit long-winded, but
No, it's
we
great.
got there.
I don't see any movement in the chat yet, but maybe you could talk to us about like your tactics or your methods. I think like the concept of fugitivity plays a sort of role, and maybe sabotage as well. And you kind of focus on websites, and if you could just kind of.
Yeah, sabotage is one of the like core concepts that I usually think along my practice, and I'm very indebted to this concept to Alberto Toscana, with whom I had a very influential for me conversation on the sabotage. And essentially, sabotage is a very well-developed strategy of amplifying the already existing dysfunctionalities of the system, right? Sabotage, like, because other ways of resistance might or imply or normally imply that you can contribute something, that you can create a new systems to counter another system, or you can create a new weapon to counter another weapon. I don't even aspire to be in the position one day to actually assemble a weapon that would counter Russian colonialism, or an infrastructure that would actually counter Russian colonialism. But what I think I can do is create those eerie doppelgangers or clones that are gonna amplify the already existing dysfunctionalities. And I usually, like in my recent performance, I developed this idea of amplifying hardwired obsolescence, right? I try to think of those colonial structures as obsolete by design. And then what are those parts that are obsolete by design? How can we point on them and make them break the like one another situation of colonial violence? So the sabotage in that sense is very interesting, and it also appeals to me obviously as a feminist strategy, because sabotage as a history is a position of a weak worker. It was a position of a saboteur, was a position of a factory worker that was denied explicit unionization, for instance. So sabotage was this embodied concept of what you can do if there are no other modes of resistance available. So I find it very beautiful also to draw from this feminist, leftist, and anarchist thought of the early era, how they were battling their own machines in the 19th century, to see how we're battling our own machines today. And I think this kind of machines might change, but our dissatisfaction with many of them, I think, is still relevant.
Thank you for that. Yeah. It had me thinking actually about your name, Anna Engelhardt, which is
Yeah.
a historically rooted name as well. I don't know if you want to
Yeah,
say.
sure. I mean, as a Russian, like, I didn't used to. It's my, like, for several months, I'm presenting under my real name, as in, like, my face. I used to work with very discreetly for a very long time. And one of those things, my real name is not Anna. Anna is an alias, and I borrowed this alias from a 19th century Russian leftist feminist. Anna Engelhardt was a person who organized the first printing co-working space, because obviously the education for women was prohibited or was available for very rich Russian women who went to Switzerland. So she and her friends, who were actually from that rich Russian background, developed this cooperative of creating this decentralized distribution of knowledge with the women of the time. They translated and published insane number of materials. But also choosing an alias, it was important for me to see who didn't end up in prison. So Anna was one of those who actually had a happy life. So that was the initial idea behind the name.
Yeah, I hope that was okay to ask. I saw on your Instagram account that you kind of like a little while ago kind of, let the alias dissolve a bit. So I thought it would be okay to ask you. So I want to, yeah, Maria has her hand raised. Thanks, Maria.
Hi, just in anticipation of students asking their own questions, I just thought I'd squeeze in mine right now. So Anna, that was really interesting to hear about the notion of sabotage and what you were saying just now about your alias as well. kind of brings the notion of sabotage as well back around. And I was wondering, how do you see, if you do at all, do you see the act of using an alias as an act of sabotage as well?
Yeah, thank you. I think yes, definitely. And I'm gonna answer this as from the perspective of cyber warfare, because in any like cyber warfare strategy, there is a strategy of not leaking any information or leaking as much false information as possible to hide the information that is actually true. And in our hyper-connected environment, the first strategy is very rarely working out well. So for me, when due to political reasons, I don't think it's great to start this conversation now about exact ones. But yeah, when I was thinking about my strategy, I decided that it's much better to develop as much fake points of my own biography. I stated a fake year of birth, a fake year, a fake city, a fake name, a fake background. So I tried to develop this identity as this person who would be very similar to me, but not too evidently similar. So one of those strategies, for instance, in the Strelka article that you mentioned, Joel, I reference myself under my real name because there was my real name is Sasha Alexeyeva. So there was a moment, and there were not that many decolonial scholars in Russia at the time. So I decided that the only plausible way to create this inheritance between me and my new fake self is to reference the old me in the text, which actually worked. Like I heard from many people that after the moment, like I kind of had the idea, but after the moment, like I saw there was reference to you, like I differentiated those. So yeah, my existence for quite some time was very tightly connected to sabotage and also sabotaging the bureaucracy of the institutions, which has been a problem for a long time. And I also reflected on that some time ago, because all the problems I was experiencing as an alias are the problems that they're not new problems, they're amplified problems that are already a lot of people facing who might be coming from a queer background or other background of discrimination, because a lot of problems I had with the documents for identity are very evidently similar to those of people who are transitioning, or me also not recognizing my voice because I had to modulate it a lot. Those were the parts that created this, yeah, network of sabotage I had to maintain. I wanted to briefly say, because I know for students it's a big pressure to invent the smartest questions sometimes. So I wanted just to let you know that you can just, if you have any stupid questions, for instance, about Russia and Ukraine, or like why Russian invasion can be called colonial invasion, I would be very happy to answer those as well. So you can literally use me as a wiki for 101 of Russian colonial aggression. Just FYI.
I think there's like something kind of interesting going on as well in these counter infrastructures and intrastructures, and this kind of lip service and hypocrisy from the West, who is still like using the oil and selling weapons and things like that. And I think it was last week, one of these Russian ministers said like, America is waging a hybrid war on Russia through this, just maybe what's your take on this kind of situation, because it's kind of maddening.
I think, I mean, the hybrid war, waging hybrid war through a proxy country is a very standard, like the golden standard colonial narrative of, because colonial powers, they never perceive countries they invade as sovereign. For them, they're not countries, they're territories for the bigger geopolitical games. So Ukraine, for both Russia and US to a certain extent, is a sandbox. It doesn't exist as a sovereign state. It doesn't exist. Like, even if you look at the sanctions and how sanctions have been framed in legal terms, sanctions are not framed as an attack on Ukrainian sovereignty. When I was looking at the sanctions that were implemented after Crimea, sanctions were usually framed as a threat to the American sovereignty, which creates this a very interesting legal paradigm of how exactly attack on Ukraine is attack on Ukraine is presenting threat for Ukraine. Full stop. Yes, it might have repercussions, but people are dying in Ukraine. They're not dying in US. They're not dying on American soil. So those narratives about wars for other countries and using countries as strategic interests, also bottleneck, one of the bottlenecks that I found out in the project, in the Death Under Computation. Because as soon as countries or empires always prepare to battle each other, Russia is always in constant preparation to have the holy war against the West, and West is in constant preparation to have a holy war against Russia. It results in the weapons they develop. They develop weapons for the nuclear war. They develop weapons for, I don't know, high-end cyber conflict waged from the offices of the CIA or something. They don't develop weapons that would be useful in the mud under, like, in one of the Ukrainian villages. Like, those colonial paradigms of where it's always about the empire also create the paradoxes of loss of wars, essentially. Like, the technologies become dysfunctional to the extent that the war can be lost. In Afghanistan, for instance, Russian weapons were very protected against radioactivity and radioactive energy, but they were not protected against insurgents and against dispersed resistance and against the bullets, essentially. So this level of ridiculousness shows how those small narratives about proxy actually results in the physical, in the kinetic military conflict. Yeah, and I think, sorry, my last point about that, because I think it's very important to address it, because a lot of people somehow, I hear this narrative a lot about US using Ukraine to attack Russia and US posing a threat to Russia. And I think in those conversations, it's important to consider the area of colonial interest of one empire or another. For US, that would definitely be Middle East, for instance, right? US has a very long history of invading certain countries and not invading others. The US interest in Ukraine is one of a hegemony, of a cultural domination, of a cultural expert, but it's not one of actual annexation of the country or the physical domination of the country or genocide. Whereas for Russia, there's a long-standing history of genocidal wars against Ukraine. Crimean Peninsula, for instance, has been annexed 4 times in history. Ukraine has been invaded multitude of times. So there are certain tendencies that should be taken into account when we make statements like who has interests where. So there should be a very valid and tangible proof to claim that somehow US has an interest in Ukraine that is the same interest as the Russian interest in Ukraine, because this is not something that we can assume knowing history of the region.
We have Madeline asking a question.
Yeah. When you were talking about death under computation, you said about Soviet cybernetics from the 1950s informing this, and I just wanted to hear more about that, like what they were, like what they were inventing or whatever.
Yeah, sure. So the systems were one of the major problems, right, in the military conflict is you don't know where to shoot. This has been an ongoing problem since forever. And there are different ways to approach this information asymmetry. And the cybernetics allowed to automate the informational inputs from the battlefield, or it was imagined as that. That's first I'm going to present how it was imagined and then how it worked out. So first, it was imagined. You can actually see here. So it was imagined. This is a drone flying over the territory, conducting reconnaissance, and then feeding the information into the central unit to make decisions of, or at least process information into digestible format, so then a commander can make decisions where to throw weapons or like people and stuff. So there was this idea of, let me also show you, just a second. Can you see my screen?
Yeah, we see it. Yeah.
Oh, okay, amazing. So yeah, the diagram you can see here is the S-25, the air defense system developed by USSR. It was one of the first actually physically developed military cybernetic projects. Basically, it worked as you can see the airplanes flying supposedly into the Soviet airspace. They become censored by the radars. Then the information from the radars goes into the cybernetic processing unit. Then the information from the cybernetic processing unit feeds into the guided missiles, and then guided missiles are fired to bring down the airplanes that are supposed to be trespassing. This is another diagram. So those visions created an idea that the military control systems can be fully automated, that humans are not needed to actually make decisions about the battlefield. You can constantly feed, because as you know, the main idea of the cybernetic is that it's a self-governed system. So the main idea was, as soon as we automate the data gathering, we can actually fully loop the cycle to create a system that is going to guide missiles and like automate the battlefield. And this is obviously 1950s, so it's the majority of what's happening on the slides is fully in theory. But then what actually happened is when Soviet invaded Afghanistan, all those weapons were actually useless. The Soviet military cybernetic weapons were not able, they were very structured for data processing and data gathering, as in gathering from sensors. But then the whole paradigm was that it has to find targets in space, like airplanes. Airplanes are very easily located in space. They don't present a very discrete target. Obviously, there are certain ways of obfuscation that are known. But in the colonial environment, the land itself presents military target, like all the ambush attacks. Like if you think about the film Predator, where the predator hides in the jungle, in the forest, the landscape itself becomes extremely important. So as soon as those systems were streamlined to find targets for assassination, but not compute the actual landscape. Landscape was disregarded as useless, essentially. It was not possible to find targets because targets were using landscape to actively hide themselves. So this inconsistency in the military perception that was developed in the Soviet cybernetics there is now inherited in the smart weapons and vision systems that we have today in the combat. This was
Wow, this is like such incredible research. And yeah, I think I don't we were before we met all together, we were talking about the Crimean project and specifically about I just think it's a very interesting also for my field in ecology about this rerouting of the river and kind of annexing and centralizing just water, this kind of element. And I don't know if you want to tell us a little bit about that. I think it's
yeah, sure. It was one of the early on in my practice experimentations, but essentially with my collaborator Sasha Stagova, we developed a website that was dedicated to the Crimean Tatar irrigation system in the Crimean Peninsula. Crimean Tatars are indigenous people of Crimea, so what we're looking at is how their water infrastructures were existing, resisting, and becoming obsolete in relation to water infrastructures of Russian Empire and later Soviet Union. We started this project because essentially we knew there is a massive ecological collapse happening in Crimea. There are constant droughts. The water, there are a lot of factories there, highly toxic factories that don't have now enough water for their cleaning systems. And not having enough water causes severe ecological consequences, like there was a chemical outbreak on one of them, on Titan plant, that caused chemical burns on the skin and like internal organs of the residents. So we tried to think of how did it happen, like how the land that was exotified and objectified as this land of a never-ending prosperity somehow became what we know it today. So yeah, the website essentially worked as this looking into the Crimean Tatar water infrastructures that were characterized by their decentralized nature and a small scale. They were described constantly by anthropologists and travelers as nurtured or cared for. They were always described in those terms of care because they required constant support, but also the water they were providing was sustainable. It would never run out. It was supporting all the people equally. If someone in the village would not have enough water, this distributed system of small channels, they would make another channel in this system of channels to supply more water to that house. Russians had very different conceptions of what a water infrastructure should look like. And since Russian Empire, the control of water was gradually consolidating, Russia monopolized water infrastructures in the first annexation of Crimea in late 19th century. And then things accelerated drastically with the Soviet Union. because Soviet Union exiled all Crimean Tatars. They were prosecuted as a nation and deported from Crimea in masse. Practically, it was genocide because a lot of them were killed either in Crimea or on the way to the exiled areas. To replace Crimean Tatars and Crimean Tatar infrastructure that couldn't exist without Crimean Tatars, obviously. They created those centralized channels, like Crimean channels, and those channels accelerated the ecological disaster and led to the ecological collapse that we're witnessing today there.
So this ongoing invasion in Ukraine at the moment is told to us in the West that Russia assumed it would go quite smoothly and it wouldn't take nearly as long. It wouldn't be this, long game. And do you think that, well, there's another question, but I'll ask this quickly. How much of that delay on that invasion was like kind of based on information warfare rather than on like a proper bullet and mortar type of thing?
This is very common for invasions to never. Invasions are never planned as a long-standing invasions. Never happened in history. Seriously, they are always planned as a very fast, very successful campaign. And this has been the case with Afghanistan, for instance, that lasted for 10 years. It was planned as a small activities in the area. It was not planned as a invasion. Or Chechnya that lasted, by the way, till 2009, which makes in total, I'm not very good with maths, but bear with me, I think 13, 15 years. Also was planned as an operation. So yeah, it's a very constant pattern. And what is very clear from that pattern is the major military development happens not prior to the invasion, it happens during the invasion. All the revolution in military affairs is actually a result of the first 1 or 2 years of major losses that empire bears. And then they start thinking, oh, maybe like something is not working and we need to revolutionize the technologies. Because I think what we have as a conception is this kind of, we do understand, thanks to Hitler, that military technologies usually give birth to the technologies of civilian nature. But then there's this idea that like military research happens almost as civilian research, as if it like happens in those scientific laboratories or like experimental warfare facilities, but actually like it happens on the ground, like by killing people. I know it sounds obvious, but then it results in like, so I think it's like very great that Russia is sanctioned essentially, because hopefully it's going to prevent this revolution in the military that we would normally expect in 2 years from happening, because they would not have microchips and sensors and lasers and all of this supply chain amazingness that is usually available for those type of wars.
We have 2 more questions, and let's see. So Malcolm, would you like to go first with yours, and then Madeline after Malcolm?
Hi, sorry, this is a bit of an annoying question. I just wanted to know the last name of one of the like practitioners that you'd worked with, called Anton.
Oh yeah,
Google him.
he's French, so
Okay.
no wonder you couldn't Google him. No worries. I might not spelled his name correctly, but at least it's gonna come up on Google, I think.
Oh, that's brilliant. Yeah, I definitely spelled it wrong. Okay, brilliant. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Yeah, you're all welcome.
Shall I ask my question? I just wanted to know, and I don't know if you're allowed to say, but like, how do you access all this amazing information?
If we can cut it out from the recording and later, I can definitely answer that.
I think we can, is that all right, y'all, to cut this part out of the recording?
Yeah, stop the recording.
I'll stop it now. Okay.